Good afternoon and good evening. I am Sister Rosemary Nassif from Loyola Marymount University. As we gather together in the presence of our everyday God, we invite you to put your name and your diocese in the chat room for our inspiration in being aware of the diversity of Catholic education geographies and realities among us. All are welcome. And we welcome wholeheartedly Keith Jones, also from Loyola Marymount University, who is managing all of our technology realities. Welcome and thank you, Keith. We now turn it over to our moderators.
Well, once again, good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to the second session of our board development virtual series sponsored by Loyola Marymount University in partnership with Creighton, St. Edward's, and Mount St. Mary's universities. I am Heather Gossard, and along with my co-moderator, Dr. Regina Haney, we are delighted to be your series guides. Whether you were with us for the last session or are signing in for the first time today, we promise you that this session on legal concerns for boards will be an exciting and informative one. Once again, whether you're a board member, a school administrator, or just someone interested in Catholic school boards, you're going to find this session a wonderful opportunity to expand and enrich your own expertise. As we prepare to begin the presentation, once again, remember, if you're just coming in, to go into the chat room. We're anxious to know you and where you're from. But let us begin, as we begin all good things, by asking God's blessings on the work that we do today. And Sister Angie, I know that you have a very special guest with us today to lead us in prayer as we go forth.
I do indeed. Thank you, Heather. I want to introduce my dear friend and pastor of one of our largest, if not the largest, parish school in the Archdiocese of Louisville. I think it is the largest, isn't it now? St. Margaret Mary. And back in the 1990s, Dr. Haney and I put together a board series. In those days, it was videotapes. And Father Hammer was one of the stars of the show. So I thought it was appropriate to ask him to bless our meeting today. Father Bill.
Well, my memory of that recording was I was also helping people learn what not to do as a pastor at a parish school and a school board. So it was a great opportunity. And today, as I come before you, I have the school board that advises me and our principal. I'm presently serving on a high school board of directors. I've attended college boards meetings as well. So I've had lots of different experiences. So it's good to be in the mix of such a large group of people as you are. And I want to take a moment to say thank you for all you do to support Catholic education. Thank you for all the advice and counsel you give to those who you support through your boards. I know if you haven't been thanked in the last 24 hours, haven't been thanked in the past week, haven't been thanked in the past month, it's been over a year since you've been thanked. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to open our prayer time first with a brief scripture passage. When Sister Angie invited me a couple of weeks ago, and it just so happened that it was approaching the second Sunday in Ordinary Time. You may remember that reading from Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, there are different kinds of spiritual gifts, but the same Spirit. There are different forms of service, but the same Lord. There are different workings, but the same God who produces all of them in everyone. To each individual, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for some benefit. To one is given through the Spirit expression of wisdom. To another, the expression of knowledge, according to the same Spirit. another, faith by the same Spirit; to another, gifts of healing by the one Spirit; to another, mighty deeds; to another, prophecy; to another, discernment of spirits; to another, variety of tongues; to another, interpretation of tongues. But one and the same Spirit produces all of these, distributing them individually to each person as the Spirit wishes. I think of all the boards that you serve on. It's a wide range of types of people, different backgrounds, and very, very many different gifts. But collectively, we unite ourselves, and particularly on all the members of your board, even though you might be an individual representative tonight. So let's take this collective group here and again give our acknowledged thanks for all the gifts you will bring. Oh, gracious and loving God, we do give you thanks and praise this day. We thank you for the gift of your time and for the time of this meeting, for this gathering. We thank you for the time you give us to share our faith, to share our wisdom, to share our knowledge, to share our many gifts. Gracious and loving God, we do ask you now to fill us and embolden us. We will faithfully serve all those needs entrusted to our stewardship and care as board members. Guide this time. May be a fruitful time of learning, a fruitful time of support, and a fruitful time for planning. All to your will. We offer this through Jesus, your Son, who is with you and with us forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Father Hammer, and thank you for blessing us by your presence tonight. Regina, as we continue, why don't you share a few important reminders with our colleagues to assure that they have all the information they need as we begin our second session?
You know, Heather, as I scanned the audience, the participants, I saw names and faces. Many of those folks, many of you I have met over my many years working with boards around the country. So it does my heart good to see these same people involved in the ministry of Catholic school boards. So kudos to you. A few reminders. You already know that in lieu of the registration fee, we ask that you make a donation to a Catholic school or charity of your choice. And I'm almost tempted to say, Heather, let us know the schools that you have contributed to. It would be good to know that. We also want to remind you that participants who engage in all 6 sessions and complete the session evaluations, you will receive a certificate of completion from Loyola Marymount University. Participants who miss more than 2 sessions will not be eligible for that certificate of completion. So if you miss more than 2, you will have the opportunity to evaluate each session, and we urge you to take the opportunity to do so. The evaluation instrument helps us to do better each time. And your comments from session 1 were both affirming and insightful as we move forward with the series. So thank you very much. We encourage you to both comment and ask questions during the presentation. And we're very fortunate to have Dr. Dale Hoyt here, who will monitor the questions in the chat room and to make sure that your questions are presented to Sister Angie. So thank you, Dale, for joining us and helping us with that important piece of the program. We are also pleased to announce that all the sessions are recorded, and many people have emailed me and asked me that. And these will be available to you at the conclusion of the series for a limited period of time, but they will be available to you. If you have any problems or questions throughout the series, contact me, rhaney@verizon.net, rhaney@verizon.net. And as always, have a great time. Take this opportunity to stretch and grow to be the best board member that you could be.
Thank you, Regina. And so let us begin our second session, Legal Concerns for Boards, which is presented by Sister Angela Shaughnessy. Sister Mary Angela Shaughnessy is a Sister of Charity of Nazareth. She holds both a Juris Doctor degree as well as a PhD, and has served as a teacher and administrator in Catholic schools from elementary through the graduate level. Sister Angela has taught education law at Spalding University, the University of San Francisco, Boston College, and Notre Dame University, to name just a few. Currently, Sister is a Senior Distinguished Fellow of Catholic Education in the Center for Catholic Education at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. A practicing attorney, Sister Angie has advised administrators and pastors for over 30 years. A highly sought after speaker, she is the author of hundreds of articles, over 30 books, and has written the National Catholic Education Association's legal articles since 1990. It is my pleasure and great honor to present Sister Mary Angela Shaughnessy.
Thank you very much. And I am so happy to be here today and to present on the topic of boards and legal issues and boards. And I would like to begin by thanking the 4 sponsoring institutions and thanking Father Bill Hammer, who, as I said, is a longtime friend and a great supporter of Catholic education. Our outcomes for today are: participants will acquire or review knowledge concerning the application of civil law to Catholic schools and their boards. That's the first outcome. The second one is participants will be able to, getting a little ahead of myself here. Participants will be able to review board documents and handbooks for inclusion of important legal principles. I think it's really important to stress handbooks and how we want to be sure that we are reflecting the mission of the school. And last week, Dr. Brown Prevet and Dr. Hoyt certainly gave us a wonderful introduction to mission, which sets the stage for everything we do in Catholic schools. So we also have to remember that our first legal obligation is to be true to the teachings of the Catholic Church, and those teachings, that reality, should be reflected in our mission. When we talk about law, legal issues, and boards, we have to understand that we work out of 2 systems of law whenever we're in a Catholic school. The first is canon law, church law, and probably most of you have seen a copy of the Code of Canon Law somewhere. And canon law, one of the big important principles is, even if a school is in fact Catholic, no school is to bear the name Catholic without the consent of competent ecclesiastical authority. So Canon 803, number 1, says this, and we need to keep this in mind as we look at legal issues, because we operate in 2 systems, canon law and civil law. As some of you know, I'm not a canon lawyer. I sometimes say I know enough to be dangerous, which is not enough. But I do believe that it's really important to understand that we can't move outside of canon law and expect to call ourselves Catholic. What kind of boards do we have in Catholic schools and parishes today? it's important for us to realize that there are at least 3 different kinds of boards. Many of you, if you're joining as a board member tonight, you may be on an advisory board. That is very often the model in our parish schools. And the advisory board is consultative. If you are in a parish school, the parish is under the authority of the pastor. And so we really can't do anything without the pastor's approval. But pastors rely on advisory boards to give them advice and to help them determine policy. And we'll be talking about the kinds of policies that we need to keep in mind. There are also boards with limited jurisdiction, and these are boards that are primarily policymaking. It's not as though they're giving advice, but their scope of jurisdiction is to make policy. If you're on a board with limited jurisdiction, and we see many of these board structures in Catholic high schools, for example, in schools that are sponsored by multiple parishes, in regional schools, and at the college and university level, we see this as well. Then we have boards of jurisdiction or trustees. Now, there's no such thing as in the Catholic Church as a board of absolute jurisdiction, because we're under the authority of the bishop and we're under the authority of canon law. So we can't say that we can do anything we want. We've seen examples that we probably don't have time to go into tonight, cases in which a board with limited jurisdiction made one decision in one school, a board of jurisdiction in another school made another decision in an almost similar set of facts, and both of them were valid, even though it appears they made different decisions, which they did, but their role is circumvented or is circumscribed by, am I a board of limited jurisdiction or am I a board of jurisdiction? So those are the boards that we see in our Catholic schools and parishes. And I'm assuming that you can each identify what board you come from. Now, when we talk about law, of course, the first and most important law is found in the Bible for us, the gospel. Many of us say, what would Jesus do? That's been around for a long time. Well, how would we know what would Jesus do? Hopefully, we are familiar with the Gospels and the 10 Commandments. Now, I'm just pulling those 2 out of the Bible, which of course has many more books than just the ones that contain the Gospel and the 10 Commandments. But we must always ask ourselves, what is this in the light of the Gospel that we are about to do? How will this look in the light of the Gospel? Is this what Jesus would do if he were here, and he is here? So always remember that we have to go back to the Gospel. I think that's part of why we start every board meeting with a prayer. And as you saw and heard tonight, Father Bill read a scripture passage to us and then prayed with us. That's what I would recommend for boards. Is that a legal issue? Well, it could be if we try to say that, well, we based our decisions on the gospel, and yet nowhere in our documents, nowhere in our board records or board minutes, if we ever indicated that we opened the meeting with a prayer. Nowhere does our agenda indicate prayer. After having studied this field since the early 1980s, when I wrote my dissertation on school law in 1984, I've been amazed at how often we are held responsible for what we say we're doing. And courts look at the mission statement of your school. I've seen this in many cases over the almost 40 years that I've been involved in study of this. So we have to ask ourselves, which way are we going to go? As we look at legal issues, legal concerns, and board meetings, we all have a sense of ethics. It might not be the best set of ethics, although I would think everyone here does. And we value honesty and integrity and respect. And we need to ask ourselves, well, where does spirituality come into play here? How do we look at spirituality? Which way will we go? I'm very grateful to Dr. Hoyt and Dr. Brown-Prevette for letting me use their slide from last week. But if you recall, they said that the fidelity to mission is of the utmost importance. And the governing body has to ensure that the mission statement includes the commitment to Catholic identity, and that the governing board uses the mission statement as a foundation and normative reference for all planning. If we don't, then we are failing in our mission as board members. I know some boards that start every board meeting with reading the mission statement, just to remind everybody, this is why we're here. This is what we say we're doing here at St. Michael's, St. Raphael's, St. Sebastian's, Holy Cross, etc. Let's don't forget that we are an academic institution, yes, but we are here because of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we see the gospel of Jesus Christ being lived out in our school. And I'm having a little difficulty. There we go. Okay, so what is the basis for the law? People say to us sometimes, well, is it common law, or is all the law that anybody ever wrote? Is it what's in the law books in my state, in the United States? Well, we have something called common law. And common law is all those decisions that have been handed down and haven't been overturned. But it's also what we find in other areas. For example, in ethics. Now, I'm not a philosopher, but I'm told by philosophers that you can find a lot of philosophers who do not agree on ethics. You can find a lot of ethicists who don't agree on ethics, but that's okay. It's still a basis for the law, how reasonable people are supposed to treat each other. If you go all the way back to the Code of Hammurabi, which we all studied, or at least reference was made to it when we were in the 9th grade and took world history, how do reasonable people treat each other? How are we supposed to treat each other? The golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, a lot of people try to say that Jesus is the one who wrote the golden rule. But I believe, while his life articulated that, I don't know that Jesus actually said that. But the gospel is full of what Jesus did say. And if you look at law at its core, which is based on an ethical approach to life, I think you will see remnants or pieces of the gospel. Thou shalt not steal. There are all kinds of statutes about not stealing and what happens if you do. The 5th commandment, to respect life. If you murder somebody, That's against morality. I think we all agree with that. So the basis for law is not so divorced or separate from the gospel that we follow. Civil law is a boundary. And those of you who have taken my classes over the year know I'm very fond of saying that. You can do anything you want inside that boundary. But once you go outside the boundary of civil law, you've got a problem. And those are the scales of justice. I try to respect copyright laws, so I look for things that are in the public domain. Just a common sign of the scales of justice. Supposed to weigh and get them even. And justice, as you've probably seen, is blind. Lady Justice is always blind because she's not supposed to be able to see who's in front of her. At least that's the idea. So as we move forward then, we sometimes find ourselves in the situation where we're asking, is accommodation possible? Okay. This is what we want to do. All right. I'll give you an example. We want to take every child that wants to come to our school. And yet we don't have the resources to meet the needs of every child who might appear at our door. These are tough decisions. And so sometimes we ask ourselves, is accommodation possible? And I'm going all the way back, I don't know what I've got on about the 9th grade tonight, but probably in freshman English, you read The Merchant of Venice. At least I don't know anybody who read Shakespeare in their freshman year who read something different than The Merchant of Venice. But in The Merchant of Venice, if you can recall, Shylock was a money lender, made a deal with the young man, and he said, I'll lend you the money, but if you don't pay me back, I'll take a pound of your flesh. Ha, ha, ha. Well, he didn't pay him back. And so Gratiano and Bassanio end up before the judge Portia, and Shylock too. Bassanio is the friend of Gratiano who owes the money, and Bassanio says to the judge, I beseech you, wrest the law once to your authority. To do a great right, do a little wrong. I don't know if you remember that that's where Shakespeare is a source of to do a great right, do a little wrong. And Portia says, and many of us had to, I know I had to learn, memorize, the quality of mercy is not strained, that Portia said. But in this particular exchange, she says, it must not be. 'Twill be recorded for a precedent. And many an error by the same example will rush into the state. It cannot be. This is what she's saying. And Bassanio's thinking, oh no, they're going to bring out the scales. And Shylock's comes in with the scales, and he's got a knife, and he said, we're only going to get a drop of, we're only going to take a pound of flesh and I'll weigh it. And if you recall, in the end, you can take your pound of flesh, but you can't shed a drop of blood. Might say this is very interesting and shows that you taught English at one time, but it also should show that the law really tries to do the right thing.
Sister Angie, we have
Yes.
a couple questions.
Okay.
So the first question for you is, what if, because you talked about the different authorities of boards, what if a diocesan high school board of limited jurisdiction is not in agreement with the chief administrator of the school and the bishop of the diocese? What is their recourse to the next step?
Well, the bishop has the last word in the diocese. In fact, the bishop is the only lawgiver in the diocese. I'd say I would try to dialogue with the bishop. Now, the chief administrator, I would think, is working for the board. But let's say you've got a situation where the chief administrator says, no, I don't like that policy, and the bishop says, I don't like that policy. Well, what is the Board of Limited Jurisdiction? What are the areas in which they're supposed to have jurisdiction? But the bottom line is that the bishop can just dissolve the board if he wants to. I like to think that, and I have found this in the many years that I have worked with schools and with bishops and with boards. Dialogue should lead us to a point that we can at least all agree to support. But if we can't, the bishop has the last word. I've seen bishops dissolve boards. I've seen religious communities dissolve boards. So if you have limited jurisdiction, then I think you say to the administrator, this is not the way we see things. Can we talk about this? Can we try to see what we might agree on? The bishop, though, does have the last word, and that's very clear in canon law. Now, there are different legal structures. I believe the vast majority of dioceses in this country are corporate souls, which means the bishop is the only member of the corporation, and if he owns that school, then he can say, this is what I want, and this is what you need to operate within. Now, if he doesn't own the school, there is the canon that says that I put up there, Canon 803. No school, even if it's in fact Catholic, can call itself Catholic without the local ordinary. We saw this happen in the 70s, and what happened is that Catholic schools said, okay, we're not going to be a Catholic school, we're going to be a school in the Catholic tradition. I can tell you, and we certainly don't have time to get into all the details here, but I can tell you that there are problems when you try. I just saw somebody put up, what if they're a public juridic person? Can you read that to me?
Sure. What if they are a public juridic person or owned by a religious order? Does your thinking change there, sister?
If the school is a public juridic person, then under a religious community, for example, the religious community is a separate juridic person, generally. So if the school is a separate juridic person, what the bishop controls is the right to say, you can call yourself a Catholic school under Canon 803. But we could still continue as a juridic person. We saw a lot of this happen in hospitals in the 90s. Catholic hospitals that were trying to figure out how, if they had doctors' practices, they could live with something where doctors were doing abortions in their offices. Now, I'm not a canon lawyer, so please keep that in mind. But I think that from a strictly civil law standard, if the public juridic person is a separately incorporated entity, the court will view that differently. However, the bishop still has the right to say whether you can call yourself Catholic or not. The same way he had with hospitals, bishops had with hospitals, and still have with hospitals.
And sister, I know we want to get on to the true and false, but I'll take this one more question. Somebody asked, is not the superintendent the bishop's delegate for Catholic education? The word superintendent. You may want to talk a little bit about that.
Yes, the superintendent is the bishop's delegate. However, if the superintendent does something that the bishop doesn't like, the bishop still has the right to say, no, you're going to have to go back and tell them they have to do it this way. Or I've seen a couple of cases where the superintendent said, I won't, and the bishop said, well, then you're done here. You're leaving me no choice but to terminate you. But yes, the bishop can delegate all the power he wants, but he can't delegate the responsibility. And he can take back whatever power he wants. I mean, we're just not, it's hard for us, I think, in the United States because we're in a democracy. But the Catholic Church is not a democracy. And I think we all know that. So, yes, the superintendent is the bishop's delegate, just like the vicar or priest is a bishop's delegate over priest. But the bishop can change that, who that person is, and remove that person. The bishop has absolute authority, canonically, unless he does something that is so egregious that people go to Rome about it. But that takes a long time, as most people know. The Brebeuf case is still in Rome, and we haven't heard much about that since it happened. So I think I'll move on if that's okay.
Yes, sister.
Okay, so we're going to look at some true and false questions. And yes, I know it's a slippery slope here, a very slippery slope. The bishop can't retain control and then claim no responsibility if something goes wrong. Yep, you're right there, person that wrote that on. I'm sorry, it just came up, but you're absolutely correct. Okay, so first question that I am trying to get up here for some reason, the slide. Thank you. Okay, we want to keep in mind the First Amendment because Congress has, in this law, in the amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech, et cetera, but ours is the establishment of religion. So there's no law, they can make no law that has something to do with state religion, for example, nor can they prohibit the free exercise of religion. So we are protected by both of those. And I do not know why I'm not getting the next slide. Okay. We keep in mind the Holy Bible, the Gospel, and we're going to look at question number 1, I believe. Okay. So Catholic school students and employees have the same rights if they were in public schools. Do Catholic school students and employees have the same rights they would have if they were in public schools? Well, if this is true, then persons in Catholic schools have freedom of speech, constitutional due process, and a right to legal counsel. And I think we all know that's not true. We do not have constitutional rights in the private sector, any part of the private sector. Once you're in a private school, and we're all in private schools, then you no longer have the protections of the Constitution. You have other protections that come from statutory law, that come from common law, and that come from contract law, but not from the Constitution. In the public school, that's the main source of the law. So we need to understand that once you're in a Catholic school, you do not have the same protections you would have if you were in public schools. And all of us, if you're a principal or an administrator or a teacher, if you've been on a board, you've probably had somebody say to you at some point in time, oh, they're violating my child's constitutional rights. And then you say, but your child doesn't have any while they're in that school. It's just like, if I go into church, which I won't do, but if I went into my parish church and decided that, well, really, I think that I should be able to say Mass. This is an example now. It's not going to happen. And I can't say, people have tried to say it, but I can't say, well, it's not fair. I don't have constitutional protections there. And the religion, the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, so we won't have a state religion, but neither will it prohibit the free exercise thereof. Okay, so we can move on to number 2. Second question. School boards have the right to vote on all school-related matters.
False.
Somebody said false. You're right. If this is true, what is the role of the president, principal, pastor, or diocese? Well, school boards don't have the right to vote on all school-related matters. For one thing, principals and presidents have the right to run their schools. There is a difference between boards and policy making and administration, and we all have to understand that. Sometimes this can get really murky, particularly, really in any one of the 3 kinds of boards, where if I'm on the board and I suddenly want the board to say, well, who's going to be vice principal of this school? I'm way out of line. I don't have a right to do that. That's not outlined as one of my responsibilities. At least I doubt it is. Appointing the president in a high school that has one or a grade school that has one, but then the principal is appointed by the president. We have volunteers who are wonderful, but then we have to look at, well, what is my role as being on the board? It's not to tell the principal how to run the school. My first year, second year as principal, we put in a school board, which is wonderful. But one of the gentlemen on the board told his daughter and her friends in the carpool, oh, don't worry. Next year, you're all going to vote on the uniform. Well, of course, they came in and said, Mr. So-and-so said, we're going to all vote on the uniform. Well, we had just put in the uniform and we weren't going to vote on a new one the next year. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but that's not what's going to happen next year. Choosing the uniform is not part of the board's role. The board should always vote on handbooks and accept the handbooks as policy. But picking out the uniform, and I sat on a school board once. It was a very interesting situation. I was on the board, my sister was on the board, my niece was on the board. This is not good. But they were having a hard time getting board members. And there were 3 teachers on the board as board members. And we spent so much time on uniforms, I thought I was going to lose my mind. That is not a good use of your board. And that's why you have administrators. And I think we all know that. We have to try to get this across to people. I'm seeing that I'm having a lot of questions there. So Dr. Hoyt, just chime in when it's time for one. Meanwhile, we're going to move on to number 3. So Catholic schools must accept students with special needs. This statement is true. What do we do if we feel we cannot meet a given student's needs? This statement is false. Okay? There's no law that says private schools have to accept students with special needs. Now, some of you have heard me talk, and you know that I am a great proponent of taking kids with special needs into our schools. What the law says is we can't discriminate against an otherwise qualified student or applicant if, with reasonable accommodation, he or she can meet our program requirements. That's a lot different than what I just wrote in that true and false question. We have to be really careful. I think it's important to say in your handbook somewhere that we do not discriminate on the basis of, race, sex, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Most of us don't discriminate on the basis of religion either. And disability, if with reasonable accommodation, we can meet the needs of the student. Okay? It's very important to put that on. When I read somebody's handbook and it says we don't discriminate on the basis of disabilities, well, that's good, but you need to say if with reasonable accommodation, we can meet your needs, because I would submit to you that it's immoral to take a child if you know you can't meet their needs. Some schools do a really good job, but you've got to have a lot of resources, etc. You can't just say anybody can come here unless indeed you mean that. Anyone can come here. But I think we have to exhaust every avenue we have before we say, I'm sorry, we just can't do it. Let me help you look for another school. Number 4, negligence is the most often litigated type of case. This is true. And if you think about it, somebody falls down the steps, somebody gets hurt on the playground. If somebody wants to go to court, they'll say the teacher or the supervisor or the aide or the principal violated a duty. But in order to have legal negligence, you've got to have these 4 elements. And with my apologies to those of you who have listened to me say this over the years, but first you have to have a duty in the situation. So if I'm walking through the mall on Saturday afternoon and I see 2 kids in my school fighting, I have no obligation to break it up. Now, we're probably going to try to break it up because that's who we are. Once we do that, we've assumed a duty we didn't have in the first place. It's possible to assume a duty you didn't have. Okay, so if you have the duty or you've assumed it, you've got to have all 4 of these. Did you violate the duty? Did you violate the duty? The violation of duty has to be what we call the proximate cause of the injury, not something so remote you can't imagine that this would have caused something. Perhaps one of the best examples came from St. Louis in 1982. It was an awful case. A little girl came to school one day wearing a costume. They were all going to dress in costumes, and her mother couldn't make a bird costume, so she got some crepe paper. Now, this is so long ago, 40 years ago, they did not have flame retardant crepe paper, wasn't treated. So the little girl has this costume on that mom sort of taped together. The teacher has a candle on her desk burning all day long to honor the Blessed Mother because it's May. Little girl walks too close to the candle, the crepe paper catches fire. She is horribly burned. Now, this is an accident. Nobody's saying the teacher thought this should happen or the teacher was trying to burn the kid. The poor teacher was terribly burned trying to put out the fire. But the teacher had a duty. The teacher violated it when she kept that lighted candle there all day. And it wasn't something that just happened in 1982 or 76. I think it would actually happen in 76. It was 82 by the time I got through the courts. When I became a principal in 1978 in high school, I'd walk around at Advent and see all these Advent wreaths and nobody had blown out the candles. So it isn't just something that happened a long time ago. Now we can use the battery candles. But back then we didn't. So duty, violation of duty, proximate cause of an injury. Well, this kid is really badly injured and she's going to have all kinds of surgery throughout her life. That's negligence. Negligence, by its own definition, means an absence of intent. So boards have to be looking for how can we best ensure that our handbooks have policies that are going to lessen the chance for negligence to occur. And number 5. I'll move on to number 5. Planning is an important duty of boards. Well, this is probably a giveaway. I mean, I really think we'd all say true. Sometimes as principals, and I know maybe I was guilty of this myself, I didn't use my board enough to help me plan. But people want to be helpful. And I will be the first one to admit that finances are not my forte. Fortunately, I had a wonderful, wonderful vice principal who is on this presentation tonight, Dr. Karen Giuliano. It was her forte. It would be utterly idiotic for me to say, I'm going to do the budget, I'm going to do this when I know that's not one of my great gifts. But if I'm an elementary principal, I may not have an assistant principal. Then can the board help me with this? The board also needs to be doing generative thinking. Even if that's not in the bylaws, even if it's not something that the principals put on the agenda, what kind of thinking out of the box can we do? We have to do immediate planning. We have to go do ongoing and long-range planning. And we certainly have to do emergency and pandemic planning. I hope you have noticed that we've been on for quite a while and I haven't said anything about the pandemic till now. These are things we never thought about. Use your board to help you plan. You can't have the teachers doing all the planning. There are many people who really want to help.
Sister, this is Dale again,
Yes,
and I'd like to ask a couple of questions that are coming up before we move forward. So the first one was, how would you define reasonable? This is very subjective. You mentioned it earlier, and the person asked, how would you define reasonable?
As in reasonable person?
The reasonable person.
Okay. That is whatever the judge or the jury decides. That's what a reasonable person is. So the way I define it is, would a person, an ordinary person of reasonable, normal intelligence in a similar situation be expected to have done that? That's how I define it anyway. The reasonable person is the standard. Would a reasonable person have done this? Would a reasonable person have done that? You know, we saw that in this recent court case where the lady pulled out her, said she thought she had the taser, but she used her gun. And the question was, would a reasonable person have made that mistake, given that they weighed a whole lot different? It was up to that's what the jury decides.
So taking this one step further, sister, you talked about the reasonable person, but now when you talked about special education, what about reasonable accommodations?
Okay, a reasonable accommodation, I always give examples like this. A $550,000 elevator is not a reasonable accommodation. However, as some of you know, I have a nephew on the spectrum. He's approaching 30 now, but a couple of the things that he needed that some people seem to have a problem with were, you need a pen with a special grip. Now, I'm going back 25 years now. And he the OT said if he could stand up to take his test, he would be able to focus better. And teachers said, well, what if everybody wants to stand up to take their test? And I said, would that really make that much difference? Now, granted, this is my nephew, so it's not as if it's just my client. Not that I don't fight for my clients. But what's a reasonable accommodation? It's going to go back to the courts. If it's going to bankrupt your school, it's not reasonable. I had a client in the public school once, and according to the plan, IEP he had, he was supposed to be able to get the homework on Friday for all the next week. A teacher sat there and said to me, I don't want to have to plan a week ahead of time. And so I think that's unreasonable. And I said to her, and you may think I've been very sarcastic, but I said, I think the reason we have schools is for students to learn, not for teachers to have jobs. She said, what if my mother-in-law dies? I said, I think we could certainly say, I know that Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so would say that's completely understandable. It's without going into a lot of the details of it, but he had a legitimate disability. This is what was recommended by all the people. And I think giving somebody their homework a week ahead of time is not unreasonable. That was my opinion anyway.
Okay, sister, we'll take with one more question, then I know you have to move on. Somebody.
Yeah, we're going to have to move on.
Right, said, how do we navigate discrimination of transgendered students in a single gender school? We can talk a lot about that, but if you want to just give a really brief answer to that, please.
Well, I think that's a question that we're all struggling with. I've been working with schools probably for the last 7 years on these issues. In a single gender school, if this is a school for girls, and we say that our mission is to prepare young women, and I don't mean to sound like I'm not commiserating with people who sincerely feel they're trapped in the wrong body, because I do commiserate with them. But we're in an ongoing time of learning. I think, and I've done any number of meetings with administrative teams trying to figure out how you're going to do this in a single sex school. Well, you have some options. You know, one is to say, well, while you're here, you have to present as a female. That's one option. Or we are going to use the they and the them, but I can tell you you're going to get enormous pushback from parents and from teachers. At least that's what I've seen. Or you simply say, you must refer to yourself as a female while you're here. That seems to be very violent to students. It's really such an exhaustive topic, Dr. Hoyt, that I would suggest that anyone who wants to discuss it, if you would contact me separately, I'll be happy to spend some time with you, if that's okay.
Great. Thank you, sister. We can move on now. Thank you.
Okay. Number 6, board should vote to approve school handbooks as policy. I think this one's really simple, true. And so what handbooks do we need? Now, even if you're an advisory board, I think it's important to say, you know, we approve of this handbook. Now, you don't have to do that, but here's a letter. When I became a principal and we finally got a board, I asked the board chair to write a letter that we put in the front of the handbook that said, now ours wasn't advisory, it was policy making. It said, the board of directors on thus and such a date adopted this handbook for this school year. I think that's a good thing to do. It says the board chair and everybody else voted on it. It's not just the principal sitting here thinking this stuff up. I think we need a parent-student handbook. I think we need a faculty staff handbook. Some people have separate athletic handbooks, or do you want to put that also in the parent-student handbook? In high school, you definitely need an athletic handbook. I'm absolutely convinced you do. And I've written, been years ago, but I've written with a coach, handbook, what should be an athletic handbook. PTO, PTA, volunteer handbooks. I think we need volunteer handbooks, and you can find the NCEA has a number of handbooks on volunteers, or a number of books on volunteers, texts that I've written or I've co-written with people. The diocesan handbook, we need to have it so that we're not constructing handbooks that go against diocesan policy. Number 7. Every school and parish should have emergency crisis safety plans. I think we all know that's true. And we've certainly seen in the last 3 years things that we never thought we'd have to deal with, like NTI. But we need plans for how do we notify the police and the fire department? What are the natural disasters that can happen? The fire, earthquake, and tornado drills. And do we have them? I think we're getting better at it, but there was a period of time where I know people that went a whole year and never had a fire drill. So we need to get ourselves on a monthly schedule. Now you might say, we're not gonna have an earthquake here. Okay. I mean, I'm so old, I remember when we thought we were gonna have bombs hitting us and we did bomb drills. So what are you supposed to do if there's a disaster? Do we have drills and routes posted? Do we have more than one plan for exit? One of the things that I started doing when I was principal many years ago was to have fire drill route A and fire drill route B. And you probably know that the fire department, if they come, they will block off one of your exits so that people have to turn around and try to go another way. More than one plan for exit. Special needs issues. Okay. If we're going to take children in that have to be in a wheelchair, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, then we better be sure we have a plan for getting them out if there's a drill. Bomb and active shooters. Now, you know, today we don't have so many bomb threats because you can trace phone calls. The active shooter issue is something we all have to be concerned with. Now, I'm not saying we need to have a handbook, but I think we need to have a plan as to what are we going to do if there is an active shooter. What's the safe place for pickup? And is there an alternative? You know, some people have said to me, well, we're going to use the Walmart across the street. Great, but you better talk to the manager of Walmart. I mean, I can't imagine that he'll say, no, you can't do that if something like this happens. But you might not be across from Walmart. You might be across from Farmer Jones' farm. So can everybody go over to the farm? These are things we need to talk about. Okay, number 8. Students and staff members can never be dismissed for a single incident. This is false. I mean, there are some things so egregious that you just can't stay there. Are offenses that may result in expulsion clearly outlined? Now, notice I said may result. I think it's better to say may or can than will or must, because, and I've done it, I got myself in a corner where I simply could not expel this kid. And that's when I learned you had to put something in your handbook that says the principal or the president reserves the right to waive any disciplinary regulation for just cause at his or her discretion. We don't have time for me to go into it, but if you really want to know what happened, just shoot me an email. So how do we distinguish expulsion versus other serious offenses? How many chances do you get? Well, I think a first grader should get more chances than a junior in high school. Zero tolerance. If a first grader says, I'm going to blow up the school, I think that's different than a 10th grader saying, I'm going to blow up the school. I'm not saying the kid should come back to that school, but I think something's going on. When my nephew was in the first grade, he said he was going to assassinate this kid. I didn't even know what assassinate meant. But the principal was someplace else, and the person that was left in charge said, oh, if you threaten to kill somebody, you're automatically expelled. Well, he wasn't expelled, but I think it illustrates, he had no clue what assassinate meant. He'd seen it on TV. Is there an appeals process? What is it? Who has the last word? The principal, the pastor, or somebody else? Number 9. Number 9, please. If parents, guardians have signed a field trip permission form, the school cannot be held liable in the event of injury. Well, we all know that's false, right? Just because somebody signed a permission slip doesn't mean that we're not going to be held responsible if someone is negligent. But it means that if we've done everything we can, they're not going to be able to sue us if something happens that we couldn't anticipate. What if the teacher or the chaperone is negligent? Well, then they can be held responsible and your insurance company will probably have to pay them off. Now, you may not know what I mean by contributory negligence, but it was a theory of law that said, if I'm 95% negligent in a case, and the injured party is 5% negligent, then the injured party can't collect because he contributed or she contributed to the injury. That's gone the way of the dodo bird. And what we have now is something called comparative negligence. So if I'm 50% liable, I could still get 50% of what somebody would give me if it was 100%. What if the permission slip cannot be found? This happens. And I will never forget one time giving a workshop, and this lady drove me to the airport. I'm not going to say where. And she said, it's been a good 20, maybe years ago or longer. She said, I got a problem. I'm taking a group of kids to blank, and we're going on a plane. I said, well, that's nice. And she said, we're leaving tomorrow morning at 5 a.m. She said, the secretary's lost the permission slips. I said, well, just have somebody call all the parents and say, come in with your child and then sign a new one. And she said, the principal doesn't want anybody to know we lost the permission slips. I said, so what are you saying? And she said, the principal told me I have to take them without permission slips. So, well, that's not a very good idea. She said, well, I'm still hoping I can convince her otherwise, but I'm not real comfortable. Can you imagine what kind of a disaster that could be? So no matter what the permission slip says, you can be held liable for negligence in the event of injury. But a properly constructed permission slip, and there are many examples in the text that I've written, and if you need one, just again, email me and I'll send you one that has the proper legal language. But you also want to be sure your diocesan attorney, if you're in a parish school, or if you have a school attorney that he or she looks at it as well. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. If a Catholic school or parish employee is wrongfully terminated, a court must order reinstatement. True or false? This is false, because the remedy for breach of contract or wrongful termination in the private sector is damages, not reinstatement. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been cases where a judge has said, oh, you got to take the kid back, or oh, you've got to take the teacher back. But it is never held up at the higher level, because in a private school, you do not have to keep somebody you don't want. You may have to pay back all the tuition. If it's discriminatory, you may have to pay even more than tuition. But at least at this point in time, with parish employees, on appeal, courts have never upheld reinstatement in private schools, Catholic schools or otherwise. Who determines if it's wrongful? Well, a judge or a jury can determine that. What about second chances? Well, what is it this person did? You know, that's what you have to ask yourself. What if the pastor and the principal disagree? I get this a lot. Well, the pastor has the last word. However, I have never said to a pastor, I think you should overrule the principal on this one and tell her she has to keep, or he has to keep that kid. Unless it is so egregious that anybody would say it. But even then, the remedy for breach of contract is not reinstatement, it's damages. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. If a faculty, staff member, or volunteer fails to report child abuse, the school can be held liable. This is true. The court's going to ask, or the judge is going to ask, was there any training? Did the faculty, staff members, and volunteers know the procedures for reporting? One of the things I've been saying for over 30 years is, at your opening faculty meeting, go over the child abuse reporting laws for your state. Or put them in your handbook and tell people to be sure they look at them. Because I believe it's now in all 50 states, every adult is a mandated reporter. So even if I'm walking through the school and I see something and I'm just a visitor, I'm still a mandated reporter if I think someone is being abused. Did the adult believe abuse occurred? And who has the obligation to report? Well, as I said, virtually every adult does. But those of us who are in positions of authority are held at an even higher standard. Okay, so let's go to number 12. Every student has a right to play a sport, be in a play, and/or join a club. False, false, false. This is true. Why have tryouts? Can the principal or president overrule a coach, director, or moderator? Well, yeah, I guess you can. Should you? Absolutely not. Now, we didn't have, when I was a high school principal, we didn't have the greatest athletic teams, but we had the most superior music department, I think, in the state. And our musicals were amazing and people came from everywhere. Well, you know what? There's only one Maria in The Sound of Music. There's only one Maria in West Side Story, right? There's only one Lori in Oklahoma. And it doesn't matter how great you tell somebody it is to be the mother superior. She wants to be Maria and wear the wedding dress. I'd have listened to a lot of people say, my daughter should have gotten the part. And then sometimes you have board members whose kids don't get the part. It's really important to say, what you have is a right to try out and be fairly evaluated. That's it. The right to try out and be fairly evaluated. You don't have a right to play a sport, be in a play, and or join a club. All you have is the right to be fairly evaluated for those things. Okay, number 13. Schools and school board members can be held liable for harassment. This is true. Anybody can be held liable for harassment. Does my school have harassment policies? What if two administrators disagree on or if harassment occurred or what the punishment should be? Who has the final word? Should the board interfere in any of these situations? Absolutely not. The board deals in policy. The administrators deal in administration. Number 14. Schools can regulate conduct on social media. This is true. You may find this surprising, but you can. So, do your handbooks address the abuse of social media? What about parent and volunteer conduct? Should the board interfere in any of these situations? No. The principal should keep the board informed, or the president should. This happened. Social media is a blessing and a curse. If a student makes a threat on social media, you have to take it seriously. If a teacher says something terrible about a student, you have to take it seriously. It's what the administrator has to do. But what do our policies in our schools say about social media? I will be updating the school handbook book that is in its 3rd edition now, but I will be doing a 4th edition of it soon, in case any of you are interested in that. Number 15. Schools can reserve the right to require the withdrawal of a student for his or her parents, guardians' conduct. This is true. You can do this. Who's the party to the contract? The parents are. What about parent conduct? We need to say this somewhere, that you can require a parent to withdraw their child because of their conduct. Now, it's got to be an extreme situation. Should the board interfere? I don't think so, but the board should be involved. The board should be informed. Number 16. What we can legally do may not be the most moral or ethical action to take. This is true. Legally, I can do a lot of things, but it might not be the right thing to do. Even though the law is supposed to be based on a moral, ethical approach to life. I can say, yeah, I'm not taking you. I don't have to give you any reason why I'm not taking you. But if it falls into some area of discrimination and that becomes known, then I may have to pay a legal price as well as a moral one. What's your rule in the end? Civil law, canon law, church law, gospel? What depends on what's the situation. Okay, move on, please.
Okay, sister, before you get on to the scripture and quotes, we're going to take some questions here. And so somebody asked, can we address D&O insurance for boards? And what does
Can we do what? I'm sorry.
Can we address D&O insurance for boards?
D&O insurance. Okay. Yes, you should always have director and officer insurance, even if it's an advisory board. People still sue people for the advice they give. So I believe it's important to have D&O insurance. I think I know we want to try to get in chat rooms, so I'm conscious of that. Unless we decide, Dr. Hoyt, Dr. Haney, that we want to not do chat rooms and go on with the questions that are being put up. I don't know.
I'll turn that over to Dr. Haney. Your thoughts?
I think we should go on. Heather, how about you?
Okay,
Yes.
then let's.
Yes, let's go on.
Okay, let's go on. I just wanted to point out some of the scripture quotes and values, because I'm almost at the end of this, that we want to keep in mind. Love one another. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, which is my very favorite one, I think. Not 7 times. Ask and it shall be given unto you. Seek and you will find. Unless you become like little children. These are ones that we need to keep in our minds, I think. And maybe you have your own favorites. But we can get so legalistic, and believe me, I can get legalistic because I do this all day long. But there's a greater law, and here it is. Okay. Dr. Hoyt, could you move to the next? Thank you. And I'll thank Dr. Hoyt for this last slide, and then we can get in the chat rooms. This is from Pope Francis. Love makes us similar. It creates equality. It breaks down walls and eliminates distances. God did this with us. And the greatest of these is love. So how about we go in chat rooms and then maybe we can come back? That be okay?
Yep, sounds good, sister.
Thank you.
Dale, do you have some additional questions from sister from the
There are
chat?
no, there are no additional questions for sister. And I believe in the chat room, if we are going into that, I do believe we have about 11 minutes left.
Okay.
And we can take, if you prefer to ask questions, I think people are going into the chat room right now. But what is the biggest legal issue facing my board is what they're talking about in the chat room. I don't think they gave that instructions going over yet. There were other slides that were there. So I don't know if we were to bring them back and just have that as an open discussion, or we're doing it in the chat.
Well, I think people would be able to say more if you could put them in a chat room for maybe 7 minutes or so,
Okay.
and then come back.
Kevin, Keith, I turn it over to you to put them in the chats.
Yes, please, Keith.
All rooms are opening now.
We are losing participants.
So we probably only have about 5 minutes
5
in the
minutes.
chat room.
We only have
Right.
5 minutes because we need some time to do the evaluation.
Oh, I'm
Okay.
sorry.
I will pull them back at 4:25.
That
Okay.
sounds great. Thank you, Keith.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Perfect.
Thank you.
And right now, there's no questions left in the chat room. I've been asking
Okay.
people to do the chats, and now I'm not controlling at all your PowerPoint. I think you're doing that, sister, right?
No, it's actually me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So good thing we had the backup.
Oh,
Very
good. Thank
good,
you,
Keith.
Keith.
Of course.
Thank you. When they come back, Sister Angie, from their breakout sessions, when they come back, is there a way you want to see what people said, or want to invite people to in any way talk a little bit about what they learned in the breakout session? Or was there something you wanted to do with the results of the talking together in the breakout rooms?
Well, I think with 5 minutes, it's going to be kind of hard to do anything.
Yes,
And
you're
I
absolutely
Did
right.
not recall, I should have rememred the evaluations. We just
Well,
had
we
a lot
don't-
more
just so-
questions.
If we have just two or 3 minutes, we don't want to not have a sense of at least giving them a little time for the
Okay.
evaluation, okay?
Right, right.
Yeah, and sister, do you think maybe Keith, instead of 7:30 sharp, we could do like 7:35, just in case people need time to do the evaluations, 5 more minutes?
That's totally up to you. I'm willing to stay, yes.
That's fine, given the reality that some people may have to leave, but
Yeah, I think
that's
we've
fine.
lost quite a few people.
Well, we always lose people when we do breakouts.
Yeah, we
We
do
always
breakouts,
lose
so-
people. That's not you, Sister Angie. We always.
I was
lose
just
people.
trying to honor the system of going to breakouts, but
Well,
Yeah.
sister, I think the reason that you had so many questions is because people were so engaged.
Yes,
in the
yes.
content of what you
yes.
were saying.
That
Um,
interaction with the questions was very good.
thank you.
I think so.
I thought the
excellent.
questions were very good.
And
Yes,
Dale, you did a
yes.
great job.
You know, the other thing is that when they come in, they can put in the chat, what's a hot topic that they hope could see in Sister Angie's future articles or books. You know, just to put that in there,
Sure.
because we may not get to all the questions, but what are some of those hot topics?
Great idea.
Yeah, no, and Angie, I thought the questions were so important. It enhanced what you were saying
Yes.
at the time. So I'm so glad you took them during the presentation. It's very good, very helpful.
Absolutely.
I think, Sister, I think you're going to have some participants communicating directly with you,
That's fine.
especially about the single-sex schools, also transgender students making accommodations. Yeah, those are
I've been
definitely
doing a
hot.
lot of work with it, but it is very difficult.
Mhm.
Most of the time when I do this work with people, we are online. It is very, they only invite a few people. People are just scared. And with recordings out there, we all have to be careful, you know,
Absolutely.
to respect the magisterium of the church. And, you know, school A can do this and school B does something else. And it doesn't mean that either one of them are wrong.
You know, and
Okay.
sometimes it becomes a public issue. It gets the headlines of the papers. You know,
Right?
that
That's what
happened
happened
in
with
Florida,
Franklin.
in Orlando. That happened in Orlando.
Right?
Everyone, I hate to cut in, but I am closing the room, so they will be back in 60 seconds.
And sister, if there's no questions, I'll have a good one for you.
Dale, weren't you going to ask the hot topic? Is
Yep,
that
I will. I will.
Perfect, perfect, perfect.
Are you coming back in? I'll give it a second.
Yeah, they have 40 seconds before they come back.
Angie, I see people came back. The number of participants increased since.
Oh, okay.
So I think they're hopping back on in a different way.
Absolutely.
So everybody is back now.
Okay.
Welcome, everybody. We only have a few short minutes, and I know that there may be a couple pressing questions. But one of the things we'd like to invite you to do is in the chat room, if there is a topic that you wish that Sister Angie would consider publishing in one of her future articles or in her book, if you would write that in the chat room, and just so that we will have kind of archive all that information for the future and to give it to Sister Angie. But if you have a question right now that you would like to ask Sister Angie, if you could put that question in the chat room and we'll be able to ask. And so I'm going to be able to ask one right now for you, Sister Angie, and it goes back to the first series when we talked about mission. So here's a school that's called Sister Angela Shaughnessy's Catholic School, who is a Christ-centered school who welcomes all. Now, you have a young lady in the school. It's a high school. It is co-ed, and the young lady is pregnant. And the president of the school says she must leave And the bishop also saying that she has to leave. She's pregnant and she's not married. And yet we're a church that is pro-life. How do you deal with that legally?
Well, legally, I don't think I know any school today that says you have to leave if you're pregnant. Now, there may be one somewhere that I missed. That is so against what we stand for today, that, or what we should have stood for all along. I mean, in 1978, I was my first year as a principal. I refused to make a girl leave who was pregnant in Boston. And I took an enormous amount of heat for it. And I'll never forget the mother who came in and said to me, well, what are you going to do if she's still pregnant on graduation? I said, I'll order a bigger gown and send somebody to get it. That wasn't the right answer. But I mean, if you're asking me, I just think if we're going to say that all life is sacred, then we cannot do that.
Thank
That
you.
is my opinion.
Any questions, any further comments, anything in the chat, that topics that you would hope that Sister Angie would cover in the future of her writings?
Well, I just want to thank all of you for being such a wonderful audience. And if you do want to be in contact with me, feel free to get a hold of me. I do work at Loyola Marymount University, so you can contact me through the Center for Catholic Ed there, or any other way you want to get a hold of me. The NCEA knows how to get a hold of me. All the people on the screen know how to get a hold of me. I'm not hard to find. So I'll be happy to just keep in mind that in the end, we're going to be judged on love.
Amen.
There are three things that last, and the greatest of these is love. And so if we always are asking ourselves, what would Jesus do? And what does love demand that I do? And how can I do that within the circumference of the law? Then I think we'll stay well within the law and well within the demands of the gospel. God bless you all.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you so much. And Sister Angie, you mentioned at the beginning, don't waste board members' time. What a great piece to take away. And you have given us safety issues, policy issues. And I love that you pointed out planning is the duty of the board. What a great way to get items, activities, agenda items, work for the board from and through that planning. So thank you so much. We do not want to waste the board members' time. We gather them for their insights and their wonderful contributions. So please, folks, take a minute in the chat room. You'll find the evaluation. Take a minute to complete that. And Keith is extending our session 5 minutes longer, so you'll have time to complete that evaluation form. Most of all, we look forward to seeing you on February 10th at either 3 or 6 o'clock Eastern time, 3 o'clock West Coast time. And the topic will be board organization and engagement, presented by two Catholic school administrators, Dr. Ryan Keelan and Dr. Dan Curtin will be the presenters. So thank you, stay healthy and safe, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you again, Sister Angie.
You're welcome.